I'm delighted to welcome everyone to our webinar today. I'm Cary Coglianese, the director of the Penn Program on Regulation at the University of Pennsylvania. And we're pleased that you can join us for our session on behavioral insights, public consultation, and regulatory policy perspectives from Europe. We have two extraordinary experts to have a conversation with and learn from today, and it's my pleasure to introduce them in a moment to you. I do want to, at the outset, let everyone know that this session is being recorded and will be made available later on the Penn Program on Regulation's YouTube channel. I also encourage anybody participating to submit questions for the panel members and for discussion later. You can do that by using the Q&A button down at the bottom of your Zoom screen. I'll be monitoring those questions that come in and will pose as many of them as I possibly can to the panel members during the discussion portion of today's program. That program is organized around a new paper by our featured speaker, Professor Nicoletta Rangone, who is a professor of administrative law at LUMSA University. She's also a professor of better regulation in the European Master of Law and Economics program, and the Jean Monnet Chair on EU Approach to Better Regulation. She's someone who has worked for national and international institutions on regulatory reforms, the OECD, the World Bank, the Italian Authority for Energy, the Corruption Prevention Authority, Ministry for Public Education, and many others. Prior to entering academe, she worked at the Italian Competition Authority. And she's going to talk today in the main presentation about her new paper entitled Improving Consultation to Ensure the European Union's Democratic Legitimacy, from Traditional Procedural Requirements to Behavioral Insights. This is a paper just recently released in the European Law Journal, and I highly recommend it to you. Following Professor Rangone's presentation, we will hear from some commentary from Christiane Arndt-Bascle, who leads the OECD's Regulatory Policy Outlook and the OECD Program on Measuring Regulatory Performance, in which she works on developing cross-country comparative indicators on the matters of domestic regulatory policy and evaluation. Before joining the Public Governance Directorate at the OECD, she worked at the OECD's Development Center, also at the Harvard Kennedy School of Government, and for the World Bank on measuring governance and its economic impact. Dr. Arndt has widely published in academia and at the OECD on a variety of issues related to policy evaluation, performance indicators, behavioral sciences, trust in government, and public participation. We're delighted to have both Professor Rangone and Dr. Arndt with us today. And I'd like to open it up, allow them to have some opening remarks. And then we'll have a little bit of a conversation, and we'll then take your questions from the audience. And we'll look forward to spending the next hour learning about the importance of strengthening and making more meaningful the role of public consultation in the regulatory process. As a way of introducing Professor Rangone and her presentation, I just wanted to take a moment to quote from the conclusion of her recent article, in which she says that consultation is widely recognized as a means to ensure transparency and participation while reducing the risks of rent-seeking, regulatory capture, and corruption. By bringing together stakeholders and public authorities in rulemaking, consultation also improves regulation, enhances its acceptance, and helps in rebuilding public trust. But she also argues that that consultation has to be, quote, genuine and, quote, real. And that's what we're here to talk about today, how to make it genuine, how to make it real, to have meaningful participation and input into improving regulatory decisions. With that, let me turn things over to Professor Rangone.
Thank you, Professor Coglianese, for the honor of speaking at this webinar and for having me at UPenn. And I also thank all the Penn Program staff for its outstanding daily work. Let me share my screen. Okay, so you already summarize this slide. I would like to add one important thing, is that this year the conference on the future of Europe has come to an end after 12 months of debate among European citizens. Several recommendations coming from the conference do call for more regular and depth citizens' involvement. This is why it's all the more crucial nowadays to question whether consultation are effective in democratizing regulation. So in theory, consultation is an effective tool to support public authorities' legitimation, increase the quality of our regulation, and enhance trust and compliance. However, consultation is not a magic formula to reach all these targets. Otherwise, in this slide, you can see a magic formula engraved in the door of a villa in Rome. So in the real world, consultation can backfire, leading to numerous detrimental consequences for rulemakers and the whole society. All these consequences are well documented in the OECD regulatory policy outlook. My point is that if you want to engage real people and get the best available input, we need to know them. Is it utopic? Well, cognitive science provides experimental methods to collect fine-tuned information about people and regulators, actually make choices and react to a given stimuli. This is not new. However, quite paradoxically, the last edition of the Better Regulation Toolbox does not even mention the relevance of cognitive insight into consultation. Even more surprisingly, cognitive insight are qualified as emerging methods for better regulation, along with sandboxes. And this happened more than 40 years after Herbert Simon received the Nobel Prize for his studies on bounded rationality. So, what are the main take-home messages to be drawn from behavioral approach to consultation? I'll focus on the way to improve accessibility to the process and to accessibility to the document. And I refer to this paper for further analysis of bias that can lead consultation to fail and possible solutions. So, actual debate on consultation is concentrated on how to improve weak interest engagement. I will focus on citizens. Citizen participation is limited everywhere due to motivational and knowledge-based obstacles. And these obstacles are emphasized, of course, in technical analysis such as impact assessment. So a prerequisite for engagement is to be sure that missing stakeholders are aware of the very existence of a consultation and of the participation opportunities. All channels potentially adequate to reach them should therefore be activated. Social media, radio, web, face-to-face, press. This is not new. However, some very common bias can actually play a role in preventing missing stakeholders from participating. For instance, inertia bias and loss aversion might hinder citizen engagement because participation requires an immediate outlay for future and unsure advantages. What practical solution? In order to nudge participation, a comparative feedback can be provided, for instance by signaling to comparable orders who have already answered a questionnaire or sent position. Otherwise, make it easy approach is an example of cognitive empowerment, which is indeed try to help people in overcoming bias, differently from nudging that leverage on bias. So make it easy approach include consultation website standardization or single access point, provided that this is not a set of links to different websites only. Another way to help people in overcoming inertia is to provide diverse consultation technique to cluster stakeholders. Some have been experienced at EU level and national level. For instance, online forums, citizen dialogues, interactive websites. However, how cluster stakeholders should be identified is an open question. And this same question is crucial also to ensure the accessibility to consultation document. Indeed, the standard narrative for rulemakers increases the power of inertia and information overload, and those biases can stop citizens approaching documents which are too long and complicated. In order to avoid this outcome, the Make It Easy approach includes questionnaires which are tailored to different stakeholders. How should this weak interest be identified? Well, a precise stakeholder mapping is crucial for weak interest engagement. However, it's not easy to figure out realistic clusters. For instance, can we assume all citizens have same skills, knowledge, and interest in the issue at stake? So the mapping activity is a sensitive, difficult, and time-consuming task, to the point that one can question whether this analysis is actually always carried out, even if the European toolbox provides a detailed methodology. But this remains a speculative question, since the mapping activities is not traced by the European Commission. One piece of good news is that AI can support rulemakers in the identification of cluster groups by means of NLP, topic modeling, and sentiment analysis. In this regard, I refer to a contribution just published in the regulatory review by Fabiana Di Porto. Having identified stakeholder clusters, then they should be addressed to different diverse narratives. So to this aim, consultation document can be divided in two parts, or different questionnaire for different consultation target can be provided. A third option, which characterizes almost every consultation launched by the European Commission, is to open all processes to citizens, even the most technical ones, and exempt citizens from filling in some paragraph. This approach makes the whole document long and complicated, to the point that information overload could prevent citizens from assessing it or from providing valuable contribution. And the slide gives you an example of this approach and of the standard narrative of rulemakers. Gatekeeper roles and platform ecosystem are certainly not expression familiar to citizens. I refer to the background paper in order to provide more examples that can lead consultation to fail. But this scenario is complicated by rulemakers not being immune to bias. Inertia, loss aversion, confirmation bias may lead to biased decisions. I refer once again to the paper for the description of possible solutions. Let me just point out a very sensitive issue related to confirmation bias. When should consultation be organized? Early stage consultation can balance public authorities' confirmation bias, but at the same time can expose citizens to a choice overload. However, late stage consultation does not allow citizens to provide their point of view if they are tuned in a document that has been already organized in articles. This is another open question. Here I would like to focus on information overload. This is perhaps the most relevant bias, the risk being that public authorities are overwhelmed by comments, focusing on reading and answering them, and therefore losing the core information provided. Addressing this bias is all the more important because its consequences may feed the position of those who claim that rulemakers should not take into consideration opinions without elaboration. Another piece of good news is that artificial intelligence can support rulemakers in this further step. AI helps in neutralizing the information overload by supporting humans in performing that task of reorganizing and analyzing comments received. However, an unduly design of the algorithm can alter the quality of information available to rulemakers to the point of compromising the guarantees of participation. So to conclude, cognitive insight and artificial intelligence are perhaps not definitive solutions in improving consultation, but can be considered new tools in the better regulation toolbox. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very, very much, Professor Rangone. We're so delighted to have you share this important work with us and to be spending some time with us here at the Penn Program on Regulation as a visiting scholar. And we're looking forward to discussing further these ideas that you've set out so well here for us today. Before we turn to questions and discussion of your presentation, I'd like to invite Christiane to share with us some of the work that the OECD has been doing with respect to public consultation, maybe also on behavioral insights and public trust as well. Christiane?
Yeah, many thanks, Cary, and many thanks, Nicoletta, for an incredibly relevant paper. I must say, I think it's very inspiring, and it is relevant beyond the European Commission and the European Union. So I think also for those who are interested in this area in other countries, there are a lot of ideas in there that can be picked up. You say in your paper already in the beginning that it looks like the European Commission has a more sophisticated system, and not just in consultation, but also in RIA and ex post evaluation. We can see that in our indicators of regulatory policy and government, which are published regularly every 3 years. And it's particularly striking for ex post evaluation. So you can find that in the Regulatory Policy Outlook and the Better Regulation Practices report that we recently published. Now, that does not at all mean that their system is perfect. We always say that while everything that is in the indicators matters, not everything that matters is in the indicators. So good practices of the EC, there might be some good practices that are not in there, but there might also be areas that need to be improved, including in the area of using cognitive insights that might not be in there. So the elements that are covered in there, and some of them relate to what you're saying, are issues around requirements and practice around the frequency of consultation, the timing. Is this actually done both early enough to actually still be open to alternatives to proposed regulation, and late as well to discuss the details of the drafts? whether anyone can participate, so how open it is, what's the transparency around it. So for instance, is there information later on what participants said? Are there any explanations? Is it easy to know about it? Are there announcements in advance? Is there a single website, etc.? Now, what we have not done is to go into depth, as we cover a lot of countries. We cover all OECD countries, all EU countries. So this is something we usually do in in-depth country reviews, which we have not done for the EU. Obviously, if we ask, we would be very keen to do that. On consultation in particular, there is a report of the audit office, where I also was part of the expert panel, which might also be relevant in that respect, which is from 2019. So what I cannot do is provide an in-depth assessment of the EC system, but as Cary said, I can more generally maybe comment on the work we do on consultation systems. We have best practices principles, which are only in draft format, because our member countries actually could not agree on some elements in it. So this also shows that there's not always full consensus what good practice actually is in the area of consultation. I can just fully agree to take a behavioral science perspective. I mean, basically, in some way, this always sounds complicated, behavioral science, but in the end, it's just about how do human beings actually function in practice and not just in theory. And that's always important to make sure that regulatory management tools are actually working. Some relevant work I can maybe point to in this respect is I've done some years ago a paper with Ellen Lind, who is an expert from Duke University on behavioral science and perceived fairness and we have published that article together in the regulatory review, and it emphasizes the elements of voice, lack of bias, respect, and explanations to ensure that citizens actually perceive governance processes as fair. And perceived fairness sounds a bit abstract, but this is an important driver of trust in government and feeling included. And we all know that one of the reasons for the crisis of democracy is also that people are feeling excluded. So this is incredibly important. And there's a clear link to what is in that paper to the paper that Nicoletta presented. There are some elements in there in how taking into account cognitive insights can improve consultation process. And that includes, for instance, to make sure what is done with feedback. It also shows how easy it actually is to measure perceived fairness, and that might be something maybe we'll pick that up later. It's important to see whether taking a behavioral science perspective actually leads us to better results or not. Now, I would also like to point to the work that's done in general on the OECD on behavioral insights. My colleague James Drummond leads that. We have been applying BI to regulatory policy since 2013, including via applications to policies as well as organizations, firms, and even policymakers themselves. And while we focused a lot more on the actual regulations in the past, we are planning to do a lot more and have already started doing that to focusing a lot more on applying BI to the institutions, processes, and tools of regulatory policy making. And there's a paper that might be relevant for the audience interested in this, which was written by James, but also by our current acting head of division, Daniel Trenker, and Daniel Shepard, which is called Behavioral Insights and Regulatory Governance, Opportunities and Challenges. Maybe I can just highlight a few points from that paper, which are particularly relevant here. I think it basically emphasizes, as Nicoletta has done, that those processes, they can fail, and it even says very clearly also in the regulatory policy outlook, where we also have put in a summary of the findings in there, is that biases and behavior barriers are in part responsible for regulatory management tools failing to reach their intended targets despite 30 years of development. And the paper notes 4 ways behavior could be affecting the efficiencies of regulatory management tools, including stakeholder engagement based on what we call the OECD's basic framework for analyzing behavioral issues. And these include, first, it's kind of ABC. So the first one is attention, limited capacity and present focus due to high workloads and fast-paced decision-making situations. 2 is beliefs, focus on data that confirms priors and overweighting of potential negatives. 3, choice, risk of groupthink amongst like-minded analysts and resistance to change from current ways of working. And 4th, determination. As also Nicoletta mentioned, assumption others do not use the tools or do so superficially, and potentially reduced sense of autonomy leading to less effort to use the tools. So all of these elements might also help to enrich this debate. And the paper already gives some ideas on how they can be addressed. It doesn't just talk about the challenges, but also about ways to address them. A few final points I would like to make is about Nicoletta. I think very rightly talks about who actually participates and how easy it is to participate. A point I find very important is that we should not mix up consultation with direct democracy. It's not a way of making people vote. And this is also how results should not be presented. We shouldn't say that percentage of participants thinks this, and this is why we're doing this now. I don't think we can use consultation as such to justify decision. It's a way about finding and collecting information on impacts and of the practical ways planned regulation would impact people, to get more ideas about potential alternative situations, and to make sure that those affected actually have that possibility to say something, even if this was not considered before, so that people don't feel so helpless, that they actually have that possibility to reach the government, and the government can think about it. Oh, okay, we haven't thought about that. So let us maybe modify the proposal accordingly. I think the idea to just justify decision on the percentage of participants can also lead to biased decisions, even and potentially even if we have statistically representative opinion polls. And depending on what the law is for, if it's, for instance, for minorities, etc., this again is not necessarily the basis for decision making. So on that is also important. So again, here it's important to, and I fully agree with Nicoletta, to proactively engage relevant stakeholders, and particularly those groups that do not have the time or resources to participate, to think about how their views can be sought out, whether the laws and the planned laws or regulations can actually work out in practice. Now, very fully agree, consultation questions can also be biased. And this sounds very obvious, but actually designing non-biased questions is not so easy to do. So I think, again, that's an area for providing guidance to policymakers. If you want to have a little bit of fun, there is a video I really love from, you can just find it on YouTube, from Yes Prime Minister, if you type in leading questions. It's a very old short clip, but it's still very up to date on how easy it is actually to get people to answer certain things in a way that you want them to answer them. What I also really like, and I've come across quite a bit in the past, are citizens panels. The OECD has also done some work on that, which is a really nice way for people to understand how complex policy problems can be. And I've heard a lot of feedback from these panels that people come in, as they usually come in, everyone thinks, okay, government should be doing this. This is what I want. And then they realize, the others actually want something else. And this is actually quite complicated. But it's a good way, I think, of realizing this, and a good basis also for democracy, so that people are aware of how complex these decision-making processes are actually, and that it's not always that easy for policymakers as well. Now, as a final point, I really love the idea, as that's written in the paper, to involve young people more. OECD is already doing a bit of work in that field. My colleague Miriam Alam, for instance, has founded the Youth Forum. And yes, I think that's very important, and picks up again to the point also to make sure to reach out to the relevant audiences.
Thank you very much, Christiane. This is terrific, and I would invite Nicoletta now to come on back and join us, and give you an opportunity, Nicoletta, if you have anything you'd like to respond to that Christiane has said. I mean, if nothing else, I wondered if you would agree with her opening comment that what you are talking about in your paper and what you've shared in your presentation has applicability well beyond the European Commission.
Thank you, Cary. Yes, an immediate reaction. I would like to underline the relevance of the procedural fairness that Christiane mentioned, and about which she has written deeply, because this is a really a turning point for public administration, not just consultation. So the idea to have public administration which is supportive and cooperative is a turning point for improving compliance, trust, and to reduce the need of public enforcement. So this is really, really relevant, not just for consultation. It's obvious, but it's always important to underline obvious things. And another point that I didn't make clear, but is obvious, that in order to implement cognitive-based consultation, of course, there is a need of a reorganization of the public sector and of the activities of public sector. I mean, I always remember a great executive order from the Obama administration who suggests to recruit behavioral scientists in the federal agencies. And this is the point, to have experts in the administration, not just in a devoted unit, a unit devoted to behavioral approach. And the second point is that the use of a behavioral approach, behavioral tested initiative, using the words of the European Commission, not just behavioral inform or align initiative, need time and is costly, because to perform an experiment you need expert and you need time to perform it, and this is to be added to the time frame that must be respected for delivering a regulation. So this is not something easy to do. This is my remark.
Thank you very much. And let me invite members of the audience to pose a question in the Q&A function. And we will try to get to as many of your questions as we can. Just to build, Nicoletta, on your last point, and this is a question both for you and Christiane, given the possibility and maybe the likelihood of confirmation bias by the regulators themselves, even before they go out for public consultation, they have an idea of what the problem might be, what their probably preferred solution is even to it. Where one would hope, a meaningful public consultation process would have regulators being open-minded, maybe even being open to seeing the problem in a different way than they're currently seeing it, and certainly being open to different solutions. But given that kind of really strong, I think, potential for confirmation bias in the way that the regulator frames questions, as you talk about in your paper, Nicoletta, being important, do you think there's any value to having some kind of distance or independence between those within a regulatory authority that are running a public consultation process and those that are actually involved in writing the rules? Now, obviously, it can't be totally separate. It shouldn't be totally, because you want the people writing the rules are going to know what the rule is about and what kinds of questions to ask and who might be interested. But on the other hand, they might be also very much invested in their own viewpoint. So in coming up with these and running a public consultation process, can you talk about what might be the role for some kind of independent or neutral, either third party, a consultant, or maybe within the regulatory agency, a different office? And I would just also sort of ask, in some sense, the same question, Nicoletta, about the experiments that you're talking about as well. Who's actually doing that? The same folks who are writing the regulations, will they be more inclined to say, oh, this experiment was a success because it yielded no input, so maybe that means we are doing the right thing, anyway, it's a possibility that there's a spillover between the substantive work on a regulation and the evaluation of the process, perhaps, as well. Would either of you like to comment on that? Nicoletta, we could start with you.
Yes, sure. Yes, this is the idea to have someone who is independent by the regulator, who organize consultation, perform consultation, perhaps is not feasible. But I'm convinced that, for instance, to draft a consultation document, it needs some skills, technical skills. And if you want to agree with our idea today to have a cognitive-based consultation, also a behavioral scientist must be involved. I think that this type of skill must be spread in the administration. I don't trust in that the intervention of a consultant or a devoted unit is really helpful, because this new idea must be also understood by people, civil servant, with more which have more traditional skill. So the need to work together, people with different background, is really important for cognitive-based consultations, and the same is for impact assessment, as we know very well. So I would suggest to have technicians, behavioral scientists, people very with a good knowledge on how to draft questions in a neutral way. But of course, they depend from the regulators, so they cannot be completely independent nor perhaps neutral. But I would like to give the floor to Christiane to react to this point.
Yeah, I think many thanks. I fully agree. I think it's very important to have support, because I think in many cases regulators might want to do this well, but they may not always know how to. So there need to be support units, and it depends on the systems and countries how that's organized. It's also important to have oversight of the process. So to make sure that the oversight body does not only look into RIA, does not only look into whether burdens have been measured well, but also looks into whether the consultation processes have been done well, and whether there's at least compliance with the requirements. Related to that is the importance to actually evaluate in general the effectiveness of the consultation processes. And that's something, unfortunately, we don't see is happening that frequently. Currently, we've seen in the last years only 9 countries and the EU have recently published an evaluation of their consultation system. So that's not a lot in the OECD context. 7 have data on compliance with consultation requirements or guidelines, and only 3 countries have done some type of perception indicator on the performance of consultations here. Relevant, for instance, here what the European Court of Auditors did, where they actually interviewed those citizens who participated in consultations and also asked them for suggestions for improvement. Again, here also important to look into data. I think Nicoletta also mentioned in her paper, the importance of actually explaining what happened with the comments. And that's also something we can look into. Obviously, regulators do not have to change their proposal based on what comes out of the consultation process. But if they never do it, that's an indication that consultation processes might be done just in a pro forma way. So to collect information on that, having a look into those documents and seeing what regulators already have to explain what they have to do with the consultation comments, that's already a very nice basis then to see if from time to time at least some of those comments find their way into changes of the proposals. Now, even regulators and people sitting in ministries are constrained. Very often, for instance, coalition agreements, they already have the solution in there. So they don't really have a lot of room for maneuver. There was already an agreement what should happen. So one of the questions we're asking ourselves as well is regulatory management, do regulatory management tools, when should they be applied? Yeah. Is it enough? Maybe it's too late where they're currently applied. Maybe in some cases it's already parties who should use regulatory management tools or should rely on, for instance, results of ex-post evaluations, etc., to inform the party programs that they are drawing up, and that this information then can also find their way in negotiations of coalitions, for instance.
On that point, I want to share one comment that came in on the Q&A function. It's more of a comment than a question, but the audience member points out the importance of setting the right expectations about citizen engagement. And I'm just reading here from the commenter, people tend to be discouraged to participate in a consultation if they think their contributions are not taken up by the administration. So maybe we should be clear from the beginning as to what the role of consultation is, especially if it is not going to be a referendum, or especially if there's only a limited range of solutions that are already predetermined. That's an important point. Another question, a question that came in from another audience member, and it follows on this point about independence in evaluation. The question is, whether there should be judicial review of public consultation. Is there, this member of the audience asked, actually a view of the European Commission at all about judicial review of the public consultation process itself? And if there were to be, how would courts, or quite frankly, how do even government officials in the agencies know whether they have bias, or what counts as a strongly held view that would lead to some bias? So this is a problem both within the agencies for regulatory management, but also would be a challenge for courts if they were to oversee the public consultation process. There's lots of questions over the years about whether the court should oversee RIA and an agency's benefit cost analysis and so forth, and the adequacy of the evidence it puts forward. Other than maybe bare bones compliance with a minimal level of procedure, is there any further role for the courts to oversee the adequacy of public consultation?
This is a very, very complicated question. I mean, there is no a unique answer. I mean, in administrative law countries, of course, if the law asks for a consultative proceeding,